in essence, what the thought was is that it would reduce the price of a home, and also it would reduce the fees that a seller would have to pay to a buyer's agent. That was the thought behind it.
There was a recent lawsuit settlement that will change the way transactions work in real estate industry, how buyers and sellers will pay commission. Now the buyer has to pay the buyer's agent commission. It might be hard for the buyers to pay the commission, right? The buyer is not really making any money. They have to come up with a down payment. Do you have any recommendations for the buyers if they don't want to have an agent?
I would get as educated as I could possibly get. Getting a real estate license is not going to educate you. It's about passing a test. It's about memorizing the questions, but it doesn't teach you knowledge.
My guest today is Mike Hickman, President and CEO of the 7 Gables Real Estate. Today he'll explain the details of this new ruling and why it will have a significant impact on how we buy and sell homes in California in the future.
Buyers have a great opportunity to look at the market and say, do I want to buy a home now? The historic changes that are taking place in real estate are the most historic changes in 100 years.
I'm Siyamak. Welcome to California Insider. Mike, it's great to have you on. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
There was a settlement, a lawsuit settlement that now is shaking up the real estate industry. You know, now the buyer's commission has to be paid by the buyer instead of the seller. Can you tell us what these settlements mean?
Well, in order to understand completely the settlement and the nature of it, you've got to go back a few years to give you some context. Okay, and the context for that is there's what we call NAR. That's the abbreviation for the National Association of Realtors. The National Association of Realtors is the largest trade association in the United States of America. Over 1.5 million members pay their dues every year to NAR, National Association of Realtors. So remember that abbreviation, because we can talk about it because there's several nuances to it. And what they had in place for the last 50 years that I can think of was a policy called the cooperative payment policy or cooperative commission policy, okay, which meant that when an agent would list a property for sale, they would offer it through the MLS, multiple listing service, not Major League Soccer, multiple listing service, right? And they would say, here's how much you're going to be paid, Mr. Buyer's agent, Mrs. Buyer's agent. This is what you'll be paid.
So like 2.5%,
So predetermined,
3%.
Predetermined and set. Was it still negotiable? Yes, it's always been negotiable, okay? But it was different because the seller would negotiate with the listing agent a fee.
So the listing agent would determine what the fees will be.
What the fees would be typically, but have to put it in writing, and the seller would agree to it for what a buyer's agent would be paid. Okay, now we'll fast forward. What this lawsuit was based on, i.e. the settlement, was the fact that they wanted to do away with, and they found that this was antitrust. It was an antitrust violation to have a set fee, pre-described, determined, to pay a buyer's agent. What the settlement did was say, you have to do away with that. They had a jury of 8 people. This was decided in Kansas City, Missouri. Of the jury members, not one person had sold or bought a house ever. And it was a jury that decided unequivocally and unanimously that the cooperative commission policy or compensation policy, they struck it down. That's the essence of the settlement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, now, essentially, probably the thought was that it doesn't make sense for the seller to pay the buyer's agent.
Well, here's what that looks like, and this is how it sort of was. And I'm ad-libbing here a little bit in paraphrasing what, I don't pretend to be an attorney on either the plaintiff or defense counsel side. But here's what that kind of looks like. If I'm a seller and you're a buyer's agent, okay, in the prior days, prior to the settlement, I'm paying you to negotiate against me. How does that make sense? In a lot of ways, it didn't make sense. And the jury didn't make sense to them.
Yeah, because what could happen is that as a buyer agent, you might want to agree to a higher price because the seller is paying the fee, right?
That was part of the theory behind it, exactly. So in essence, what the thought was is that it would reduce the price of a home, make homes more affordable. It might reduce for buyers the price of a home, okay, in terms of either down payment or affordability. And also it would reduce the fees that a seller would have to pay, okay, to a buyer's agent. That was the thought behind it.
We're covering California issues, as you know. If you want us to cover the stories that are impacting your day-to-day life in California, reach out to me at Siyamak at californiainsider.com. Now, what's the impact? We're hearing there is a lot of uncertainty about, because this was a rule for many, many years in the real estate space, right? This was the kind of understanding, the way.
As far back as I can remember, okay, so at least 50, 60 years, this is the way that real estate had been sold and the way that it was operating up until October of last year. And that jury decided and made all the difference in what they called the Sitzer-Burnett case versus NAR and NAR, National Association of Realtors, and a lot of other agencies across the country. As a result of that decision in the case, other companies, like a company called Anywhere is a holding company that basically operates Sotheby's, Century 21's, Coldwell Banker, and Better Homes and Garden, ERA, and some other companies. They ended up paying to settle their case. They paid $81 million, $83 million to get out of the case. So far, roughly speaking, the defendants in these cases have paid about $730 million.
Wow.
Okay? The attorneys from that are taking about $210 million themselves. And this became a class action lawsuit later on after the initial filings. What's interesting is Mr. Sitzer, who originated the lawsuit, just opened a real estate company. Isn't that interesting? Okay. I thought I'd throw that in because it's kind of an interesting thing, a little nuance that not very well publicized anywhere. So what that looked like is, in the past, here's the difference, okay? You, as a seller, were mandated to pay a buyer's agent. Today, that cooperative compensation policy is no longer. You are no longer mandated to pay a buyer's agent. You can if you choose, but it's voluntary.
And how does that work for the buyers? Can you tell us how does it work now?
Sure. Mechanically speaking, okay, for a moment, using form talk and things like that, without getting too nuanced in it, basically, for someone in my business, in the real estate industry, to show a house to their mother, their sister, their husband, their daughter, whoever it is, they must have completed a form called a Buyer Representation Broker Compensation Agreement. The acronym for that, or abbreviation, is BRBC. Okay, that must be signed before you tour a property if you've made an appointment to show it to somebody. Now, if you're going to an open house, it's not necessary. So there is a clear distinction between a buyer visiting an open house, where there's no BRBC. Sorry to use that acronym, but it's true. There's not required at all.
So in that one is usually the seller's agent, or it could be other agents there. But if somebody decides to show you a property, you have to sign an agreement with them.
That's correct. It's mandated. And on top of that, not only is it mandated by the settlement, and everybody agreed to, but it's also mandated in our local multiple listing service, MLS, that if you don't have it when you're showing a property, you actually could be fined. The fine start at $1,000 and go as high as $7,500 for repeat offenders.
Now, does it make it harder for the agents and buyers? Because sometimes, as a buyer, you may not want to commit right up front to an agent, like if the first time they're showing you, and then as an agent, probably it would be hard to get a buyer to sign that, right?
I think some buyers are balking at it, okay? Because I think some agents aren't explaining it correctly. This can be an exclusive contract. It can be non-exclusive. It can be for one property. It can be for one day. It can be for 2 days. What it can't do is be in excess of 3 months. And I've actually seen contracts come in now where they're trying to contract with the buyer for 12 months. That is unenforceable. Okay, so if I wanted to show you a property, I could say, here, you need to sign this form, and as soon as we're done seeing this property, we'll void the form. But you need the form in order to see the property executed. You need the form executed to see the property.
And why are they doing that? Is it to know exactly how much commission so you have to agree on all of that, right? How much commission you're willing to pay and all that, right?
And what I referred to earlier is a buyer representation broker compensation agreement, BRBC. It talks about and discusses in very clear language what the buyer will be paying the buyer's agent. So in compliance with the settlement, now let me just jump off that track for a minute and go to the settlement. National Association of Realtors settled with with the plaintiffs in the action for $418 million. That settlement covered all of the agents in the entire country. It left 94 brokerages out of that settlement who had sold or had volume, if you will, of sales in excess of $2 billion. So there's some not so happy brokerages around the country with their own association. Feel like they kind of left them out a little bit. Now, back on track. That settlement said these things have to be in effect by August the 17th. And that's where the big changes have taken place.
Of this year,
of this year, August 17, 2024. All of those changes now have taken place. So now we're starting to get evidence, anecdotal evidence of what's happening. We're hearing about things that are happening and the changes so that we can perform better and do better in the consumer's eyes. Our philosophy is customer first. Whatever they want, that's what we do. That's reasonable, of course, in accordance with the law.
So now there's another thought that comes into mind is it might be hard for the buyers to pay the commission, right? Is because the buyer is not really making any money. They have to come up with a down payment. And sometimes people struggling to come up with even 5%, 10%. If they have unique kind of loans, now they have to pay this 2.5%, 3%. How does that work?
You know, it's a great question because here's where there's some nuances and differences. On the form that I referred to, okay, the BRBC, and another form that it can accompany that called the SPBB, seller payment, okay, that's now you're going to include that form. Hold on though. With the BRBC, you can say, A, I don't have the money, or I can't finance it. Therefore, I'm submitting what we call an SPBB, seller payment to broker compensation, basically, okay?
So you can actually say, I don't have the money, assign it to the seller, have the seller pay it.
That's correct. And then in that form, there's an avenue and path that is in compliance with the settlement, perfectly legal too, that says, I can't afford to pay it, I can't finance it, like an FHA buyer might, okay, with 3% down, or a VA buyer. VA recently adjusted their loan programs so you can finance it, but maybe it's not enough and maybe they don't want to. So they say, here, I'm submitting this form. Mr. Seller, please pay my agent, the buyer's broker, a commission. And the seller can say yes or no. If the seller says no, then the agent has a decision to make. Do I represent the buyer for free at no cost, essentially? Or do I say I'm going to withdraw from the situation, which they have the right to do as an agent. And then that buyer could then be represented by either the other agent or no representation at all.
Now, going to no representation at all, or some people might say, okay, I did all the work, I found a place, and then all I need is the legal help. What are your thoughts on that? Is it possible for people to negotiate a fee?
All the fees are negotiable, number one. That's the primary result, number one result of the settlement, okay? They've always been negotiable, but they're more transparent in the negotiability of the fees. And buyers and sellers are much more aware than they have been in the past of the negotiability of those fees. When it comes to legal representation, there's, on our forms that we use, on a residential listing agreement, there's a portion of the form that discusses and addresses this issue of an unrepresented buyer and how that is handled by the seller. What does the agent want to do? The problem with an unrepresented buyer is they have to get some forms to fill out in order to make an offer on a property. And if you look at the number of pages that you're talking about, it's probably somewhere between 50 to 70 pages of forms that are necessary. And there's very strict timelines, very detailed information in there that's, unless you are very familiar with it or you're an attorney that practices transactional real estate law, you may not be aware of.
So you think some buyers, if they go that route, they might face some challenges in the process? Or
I think they easily could, and some buyers may not. But I know this, that the listing agent, okay, so that they stay, how do I say this to you? They stay free of any kind of fiduciary responsibility to the buyer or duty to the buyer, has to be hands-off to the buyer. Here you go. You're going to have to get forms. You're going to have to fill them out yourself. I can't do that for you if you're unrepresented. And I know how that sounds. It sounds like, boy, just a lack of cooperation on the part of the agent. But it's really kind of a legal matter so that we don't step into the fiduciary responsibility role with a buyer and stay away from that if they want to be unrepresented.
Because if the seller's agent does that, then it's not right? Otherwise, they're going to be representing the buyer too. Is that
Exactly. And then you step into a dual agency role, okay? And the seller may not want that to happen, so that has to be thoroughly discussed with the seller.
Now, Mike? You've been in this business for a long time. How are you guys impacted, the real estate agents?
For me, from my standpoint, a very positive way, okay? And I'm trying to impart that value of being positive and that mindset of being positive, because here's why. The consumer is our client. The consumer is the one that we service. The consumer is the one that's paying us, okay? If we always stay customer first or consumer first, we'll never have an issue with doing the wrong thing. So the impact is this. Everything is negotiable. How do we now explain this to a buyer? How do we explain it to a seller? And do so in a transparent way that everybody knows what's going on. See, in the past, and here's a good example of this, of the past. When I knew about this case, in August a year ago, before the trial, I went to a research firm here in Orange County. Okay, they're a nationwide research firm. And I conducted a research assignment, if you will, okay, blind study with buyers. They found the buyers. We hired the mediator, had nothing to do with us. They didn't know who was behind the glass wall, had no idea. And we interviewed buyers for about 4 to 5 hours that day. Some of them were new home buyers, first-time home buyers. Some of them were experienced investors. Some of them were a lower price range. Some of them were a higher price range. And what we discovered from all of this, in a nutshell, like, where do we need to be? We thought we needed to be over here. So I was leading my management team and leadership team. They said, I asked them, where do you think we need to be? And they said, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to do this. I said, it just doesn't feel right to me. I think you're off. And they looked at me like I had 4 eyeballs, okay? Seriously. So we're sitting in this conference room, and I said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to hire a research firm, and we're going to find out the truth about what they think about our industry, what they think about agents as a whole, and what they think about the potential changes. And we learned it was an aha moment for sure, because we actually went to the source instead of telling and trying to figure out what we thought, everybody would want or what they would think, what they would be thinking. So from that, we began to build a program around that said, how do we inform buyers? How do we tell them what the changes will be? Because I had a feeling, based on some other things that, some information I had, that this lawsuit was not going well for NAR, okay, and the defendants in the case. I felt like the plaintiffs were going to win. And I explained this to our brokerage over a year ago. And based on that, we began to train on this a year ago, based on what buyers told us what they wanted.
What did they tell you guys?
They told us that they had no idea how the buyer's agent got paid. Many of them did, not all, but many of them said, I don't know how much they get paid. I think it's 6% for a buyer's agent. They even said that comment, which was shocking to us. We all looked at each other like, what just happened? How could that be? How do they not know? Well, it's not on their closing statement. It's not anywhere. It's not transparent to a buyer, right? There's no way for a buyer to know unless they ask the agent, and the agent oftentimes is reluctant to tell them. That compensation to a buyer's agent only showed on a seller's closing statement or on a commission disbursement analysis provided by the escrow company.
So it didn't show anywhere else?
Nowhere else. In summary form, I could go on and on about it because it was fascinating. The lack of knowledge about how a buyer's agent was paid, the difference of opinion about would you pay a buyer's agent a commission when I sent a note in to the moderator. And remember this is totally a neutral situation and research project. The moderator did not know the name of my company. They did not know who was behind that wall. The panel members knew that there was somebody watching, but they had no idea who. No company name. None of them had bought a house from us either, okay, or sold a house through us. So we were getting what I consider to be fairly unfiltered information, okay? So they didn't know how much a buyer's agent was getting paid. Many of them thought it was an amount that was not even close. Some of them said I would never pay a buyer's agent. Some of them said I'd be happy to pay a buyer's agent. And some of them said, maybe, and if not, there was a couple people who said, 2 people said, I'm going to look for a platform online and do it myself. Or, better yet, for the amount of commission these guys get paid, I'll go get my real estate license in 4 months, And I have a license then, and I'll take the commission because it would be better off than paying a buyer's agent a commission. Okay, I understand that. So we got a variance of answers, and it was really clear to us that there was no clear path about what buyers thought, no clear thought about what buyers thought about how we were compensated, and there was a lack of perception of value to a buyer's agent attached to that. That's where we went to work and began to drive the value of a buyer's agent home with our own staff, our 500 agents or so.
If you like California Insider and you like to know what's going on in California, make sure to check out Epoch Times. This is a newspaper that started by a group of Chinese Americans because of human rights abuses in China, and now is starting to grow here. Make sure to go to the Epoch Times website and check out the California section, where you can get a lot of fresh perspectives on what's going on in California. Now let's go back to the interview. So based on your study, it's fascinating, you were ahead of the curve on this. Based on your study, do you think that now that this settlement happened and now that this new ruling came about, do you think the buyer's side will get shaken up by the consumer that's thinking like that?
I hope so. You didn't expect that answer, I'm sure, but I hope so. Because here's why. What I'm finding and the feedback I'm getting is that buyers like it because they now know what's going on. They're fully aware. And why shouldn't they be? First of all. Second of all, they have the ability to negotiate a fee for their representation instead of having it set with. There's all sorts of levels of experience, intelligence, education in our industry. And yet the person who's getting a certain percentage, they could be brand new or they could be 20 years of experience and have sold thousands of homes. And yet they're both getting paid the same amount of money. In what industry does that make sense? So I think when you look at it from a consumer standpoint and our standpoint, the consumer is the one that should win. That's what we believe in. That's my value system. That's what we believe in at Seven Gables. So to the extent that a buyer's going to be happier knowing what's going on, they can negotiate the fees. And in addition to that, they know that somebody's representing them based on a form. Here's the upshot of what's happening. The level of professionalism has stepped up in the industry. We're hearing that. We're glad that this came about because actually agents are becoming more professional, which in turn means of the 1.5 million members of NAR across the country, we think that'll shrink by 20 to 30%. Agents leaving the industry who can't keep up with the changes, can't communicate or articulate their value properly to a buyer's needs, wants, and desires, what they want.
So you're looking at this and from different angles, from the perspective of the customer and the agent. Some other agents in this space may be like shocked by these changes. What would you tell them?
Here's a perfect example of being shocked by the changes. I received a call about 2 weeks ago, and that call originated from one of our agents, went to our general legal counsel, and I received a call from our legal counsel, who's also our general manager. And they said an agent submitted an offer post August 17th, so there was no compensation in the MLS, multiple listing service, no compensation listed, nothing at all. Submitted an offer, none of the proper forms, no BRBC, remember that form, SPBB, okay, that form. And the question that was posed to me is, what do we do with this agent? Because there's no method for him to get compensated at all.
So the seller won't be compensating him because there's zero.
There's no buyer compensation, there's no seller compensation. I thought, well, he either doesn't know about it or he's very generous with his time and doesn't believe that his representation is worth any money or value. So I said, we need to call him. So our general legal counsel, as general manager, called him, not his legal counsel, and said, are you aware of the changes? The response was, what changes? And when we told him, he had no idea. His broker had not told him about it, had not any bit of knowledge about it. So this gentleman said, I said, we need to have you go back and rewrite your offer, or at least include these forms so that you can be paid, if you want to be paid. And he appreciated it very much. That's just illustrative of what's going on in our industry. There's the haves in terms of knowledge and the have-nots in terms of knowledge. And that's the dichotomy that's existing right now that's driving the two apart. It's driving a wedge between those two groups of people. The people that have knowledge are operating at a very high level. Okay, and I think to those agents and to that point, I think they're enjoying it. I think they enjoy the change. Because with change, my belief system is, and I've told agents this and our team this for a year now, with change comes opportunity. The opportunity is step up, be a more professional agent, more professional realtor in the business today. Represent buyers in a better way than anybody else can do it in the industry. Okay, make it customer first, not agent first, not closing first.
So you have to show your value essentially as an agent in order to get that commission, and then the ones that are not able to, they're going to kind of exit the space because there will be some buyers that are going to do it themselves or they're going to do other ways.
Absolutely. And I think they're going to find out that it's a little bit more difficult than they originally thought, okay? Because here's what that looks like. Here's a perfect example. I'll tell you a story, okay? There's online portals, okay? And on those portals, how this works within our industry is as follows.
It's just these websites you can go and or apps that you can see all the listings,
right? And
they're everywhere.
You can pretty well figure out what they are without me telling you, because if somebody's doing a home search, you can go to those particular, I call them portals, but those websites, and you can search for a property, see what's out there. They give you a lot of very valuable information. But the important point I'm trying to make here is that all that information comes from the agent who listed the property. Okay? So for example, when I put a property into our database of 100,000 members at California Regional Multiple Listing Service, okay, that is automatically syndicated to websites all around the world. But let's just limit it down to the portals, if you will, or those websites where they go to. So for example, if you were looking for a home now and you went to one of those websites and you searched, typically what happens is if you find a property you like, there's 2 or 3 agents listed on the side of the page. And I say typically, not always. And if you click on, you want to see this property, one of those agents will call you, maybe more. So if one of those agents shows you a property, they could be from LA, but they've bought that space. They're paying a fee to buy that space.
To be on that
website or that app, right? May not know anything about the community, may not know anything about the house, may not know anything about the property, and all likelihood will be seeing the house for the first time and knowing the same thing in the community. Here's the upshot of all that. What the buyers out there don't know. So let's say you as a buyer decide, I like this house. This is perfect for our family. Thank you so much. And that agent who met you from one of the websites or portals, if you will, decides to write you an offer, represents you, does a BRBC, all of that. When you close your escrow as a buyer, that particular app, if you will, or portal will receive anywhere from 30 to 50% of that agent's fees. That's very unknown in the industry, very unknown to the consumer, that these various companies, if you will, and apps and portals are taking those fees that are generated. So when people are talking about reducing fees, there's an underlying fee and impact being paid to these other companies. This is an example I can use. On an $800,000 purchase, let's say there's 2.5% fee being paid to the buyer's agent. It would be $20,000. 40% of that goes to this company over here, not to be named. How much is that? $8,000. $8,000 right off the top goes to that because the broker and the agent share in that split with that company. As a result of that, there's $12,000 left. Let's just say as an average, the agent receives 80% and the company receives 20%. The company's receiving $2,400. And if I can do my math right, the agent's receiving about $9,600. So the company that you contacted as a buyer is receiving almost the same amount of money as the agent, okay, and about 3 times, 4 times almost as much, 3.5 times as much as the broker does on that particular transaction. Nowhere is that disclosed. Nowhere is that seen on any paperwork to the buyer. So when you talk about lowering the level of commission levels to a buyer, what they might pay, you have to take some of these things into consideration.
Now, do you think those companies probably will get impacted too, because now the agent has to make a deal because it's not very clear what they would make, right? The 2.5% is gone as a buyer's agent now.
It could be any percentage, could be what a seller's willing to pay, may negotiate. So what that looks like is seller may consider paying compensation, okay, and it's fully negotiable. You cannot state a specific compensation from the seller's point of view to the agent on the other side representing the buyer. That cannot happen. You will be violating the mandate. You'll be violating the settlement issues completely.
So you think there will be a big shakeup in this space?
It's already happening. Big shakeup in this space. And some people are trying to, find a shortcut. Some people are trying to do workarounds. But I can tell you categorically they will fail. And here's why. The plaintiffs in this action have made it their point to try to enforce this, which I happen to agree with the settlement. I think it's a good thing. I think it's good for consumers. But what they've done is they've begun secret shopping. They call them decoys. They're calling agents. They're using sophisticated means to find agents who are violating this, and the fines begin at $1,000, as I said.
For each time.
Here's a perfect example story. We have in our industry a thing called showing time, where you can set up with digitally and automatically showing a property. So the buyer's agent calls, sets up a time to see this property, and says, "May I see this property? And by the way, are you offering compensation?" Seller's agent calls back through the voicemail of showing time and says, "Yes, and we're paying 2%. Bing, agent gets fined $1,000 because it's run through a program that other people can see. Now the sheriff's in town, the MLS, if you will, fine that agent $1,000 for making that statement because it's in violation of the settlement agreement saying the seller will offer a 2% commission to the buyer's agent.
So why is that in the conflict? Because isn't the seller...
You cannot state a set amount to be paid to a buyer's agent if you represent the seller. The correct language is, and I've enforced this in my company, seller may consider paying compensation, but it's fully negotiable.
I see. So it cannot be a set amount
Submit
anymore.
it with your offer.
Yeah, it cannot be a set amount anymore.
That's correct. That has to be super clear to everybody that's listening and everybody that's operating in our business. And unfortunately, it's not. We have agents doing just the opposite. And they will be caught. They could be sued. They could find themselves at the wrong end of a lawsuit. And they could be fined severely. And if it's your listing, the MLS has said categorically, on the second violation, we may take your listing out of the MLS. We may extract it. How are you going to explain that to a seller that you're representing? So you don't want to misrepresent a seller, so just comply with the rules. Comply with the MLS rules, comply with the settlement issues, and make life easy for yourself. But we have a lot of people that aren't doing that. I can tell you that.
Do you think this will change the values? Spaces that are commission-based sometimes is like fast-paced and there's a lot of different people trying to get the most money. Do you think it will change the way this industry operates in terms of values?
I hope so. I want to tell you, I'm an advocate of change in that direction. Our values sometimes in this industry could be better. There's a lot of people that do it really, really well, that care. They have compassion, they have concern, and they have great values when they deal with their clients. A lot of people in this industry. But like typically in most industries, there's a small percentage that kind of tend to ruin it for others. That becomes so transactional that the relationship and the care, compassion, and concern are lacking. And that's where values come into play. And I think people are going to have to be more of a values-driven agent, a values-driven company than ever before in the past.
And Mike, while we have you, do you have any recommendations for the buyers? The ones that want to go on their own, do you have any gut views or something they should think about if they don't want to have an agent?
If they don't want to have an agent, I would recommend that they, A, hire an attorney. They could hire an attorney to represent them. They may have a retainer fee to pay. They may or may not get the property they offer on. I would recommend a couple of books that they might want to read about how to operate. They can go online to Google, they can search it, but get some information and background about how to proceed in a real estate transaction in California. Because California is different than Texas, different than all other states. Everybody has their nuances from state to state when it comes to dealing in real estate. But I would get as educated as I could possibly get. Getting a real estate license is not going to educate you. Okay, needless to say, it's about passing a test, and I know that how that sounds, and I know that California Association of Realtors would not be happy with me right now, or the Department of Real Estate, but it's a fact. It is a true fact. It's about passing the test. It's about memorizing the questions, but it doesn't teach you knowledge. There's knowledge-based information on the web. There's knowledge-based information in books. And if you're going to hire an attorney, my advice to you is do your research and hire a real estate transactional lawyer. There's a big difference between that and a personal injury lawyer trying to represent you. Okay, not that either one of them is better person than the other, but the knowledge and the background that you would have from a real estate transactional standpoint. And there's places you can research that online.
And what about the ones that want to negotiate? Now that this is open and they want to have an agent, but they want to negotiate with them, how do they go about setting up that fee? Do you have any thoughts?
I think a buyer has to look at this, and the agent, more importantly, has to inform the buyer. Okay, if you're strictly talking about buyers now, they have to inform a buyer about what nuances are involved in this and what the possibilities are. For example, if you sign a BRBC, the form I referenced earlier, buyer representation agreement, and you ask for 3% from the buyer, but the seller is only offering 2% at some point because you submit the form with it, the proper form, you're only going to get 2%. Likewise, we just had an example. I was talking on the phone in my
Unless
drive.
the buyer is willing to pay you, right?
Yeah, and I would not go back. I would not advise you to go back to the buyer and ask for more payment for the buyer. Some agents will, though, I promise you. I promise you that's going to happen. And I think that'll backfire on the agent. Continuing that thought process, I just had an example this morning where one of our agents filled out a BRBC with their client for 1.5%. She submitted an offer on behalf of her client, and the seller counteroffered back and offered 2.5% to the selling agent because there were multiple offers and they were all the same. But here's the upshot of that. She's only entitled to 1.5%. Even if the seller is willing to offer you 2.5%, if your BRBC, because that's the controlling document, only said 1.5%, that's all you can have. So she made a mistake, perhaps, maybe not. The buyer's happy, seller's happy, she's probably not real happy, but those are the nuances about our industry that have to be explained from agent to buyer. Whatever we put in the BRBC will be the standard by which a buyer's agent would be paid. And if it's less than what the seller's offering, you're stuck with it, so to speak. That's what you're going to be paid by the seller.
What about people negotiating this being as a flat fee than a percentage? And some people might argue that the work is the same whether you sell a $1 million home or a $2 million home, but the compensation would be a lot more if you go by percentage. What are your thoughts on that?
I have mixed emotions about it, mixed thoughts about it. But overall, I think the flat fee is a good idea because there are many cases where a flat fee is better than a percentage. And I did some research on this. Now, it's a couple months old. This was June, so I'm a couple months behind. But before the information in the database went away, I surveyed all of Orange County's listings. At the time, there were 2,495 listings available in Orange County. And I took the percentage of, and I wanted to know exact numbers, who was offering 0, who was offering a flat fee, who was offering 3%, who was offering 2.5%, so on and so forth. Here's what it came back at. There was a small percentage offering 0, small percentage offering 3, but a growing number, a trend was developing of flat fees. Interesting that you would bring that up because it's just easier for some people to say, this is what I'm willing to pay, this much money, not a percentage. Because here's what happens in our industry a lot, and this is another piece of advice for sellers. And the agents out there aren't going to like this when I say this. When we sell a property, oftentimes a buyer might do an inspection, although I think the seller should be giving the buyer an inspection before they make an offer. But oftentimes that's not the practice in our industry. Buyer inspects the property and they find some things that are wrong with the property. They go to the seller and say, I'd like let's say, as an example, a $10,000 credit for termite work, for other things that are wrong with the property, and I'll do the work myself. And the seller says, that sounds great because I don't want to do the work. I'm kind of done, we're moving, etc. Great. So what tends to happen is there's a $10,000 credit given, or sometimes, because of our paperwork, you have the option of reducing the price. What happens when there's a credit given in, let's say it sells for $100,000, if there's a $10,000 credit given, the commissions are still being paid on $100,000, not $90,000. Do you see what I'm follow me? And I think that's wrong. I think our commissions should be adjusted to the net amount as opposed to the actual sales price. And I think that should be a mandate in our industry. There's a lot of people that will disagree with me because they say, oh my gosh, that's not the sales price. But really, isn't that sort of the sales price?
That's really the sales price, right?
Isn't
because
it really
they're lowering.
Isn't the net the sales price? See, my argument is the net's the sales price, not what it actually sells for here. It's what the seller's receiving after they pay for credits.
For some of the people that are in the real estate, like looking to purchase homes, and this is a crazy time, the real estate interest rates are so high, and for somebody to buy a home in California, you should be making a few $100,000 a year at least to be able to afford. What are your thoughts on what's happening? Is there any shakeup happening in the real estate market here?
There is a shakeup happening. A couple of things that are positive for home buyers, potential home buyers, and actually home sellers too. Number one, the Federal Reserve expects to reduce their interest rate levels, which is the money they loan to Federal Reserve members, not necessarily directly to buyers and sellers, which term buyers, but rather that has a positive effect in terms of consumer confidence. So when the Fed rate, as it's referred to, gets decreased next week by probably a quarter, maybe a half a point, it will have an impact. A lot of people in the lending industry, in our industry, say it's already baked in to interest rates. What I always look at is not what the Federal Reserve is doing, which is important, okay, because that controls the flow of money in our economy, M1 and M2, so to speak, okay, without getting technical. But rather, I look at the 10-year Treasury. The 10-year Treasury is directly tied to what interest rates in our industry are all about. The 10-year Treasury, as of yesterday afternoon and as of early this morning, when buying and selling of those Treasuries was going off at 6:30 this morning, was at a 52-week low, which means interest rates are approaching a 52-week low in our historic real estate market in California. I'm also noticing that at the same time there's a convergence of and confluence of more properties into the marketplace. Let me give you an example of that. A year ago, what I use for that is months of inventory, MOI, months of inventory. Sat at about 1.2 months of inventory in all of Orange County. Here's what it means. Of all the homes in the market, if we did not list one more home, it would take 1.2 months for them to sell out.
All of them, right.
And think about what 1.2 months represents in terms of days. It's about 40 days. 40 days to sell out of the market if another home is not listed. And therein lies the reason that home prices have shot up, okay, besides a lot of other factors, but one of the primary reasons, supply and demand. It's very simple economics. A year ago it was at 1.2. Let me make my point. Today it's at 2.0. So there is essentially a rise in the inventories in the market. There are more properties in the marketplace. There are better choices for buyers. Interest rates have decreased. Interest rates will be under 6% if they're not already. I know that we close loans out in my industry and in my companies, one of my companies, for under 6% today. So we're getting to a point where buyers, I think, will feel much more comfortable in dealing with interest rates that are under 6%. There's more homes to choose from for buyers, which means great choices, and they can slow the velocity of the market down so that buyers can make sensible decisions. There's statistical information out there that says during the pandemic, when the market gets so heated, between 25 and 40% of the buyers that bought are thoroughly unhappy with their homes. Now, there's different sources for that information.
Because
they were rushed into it. They had to outbid somebody to get a home, and because interest rates were so low and they wanted to take advantage of it. And now it's the reverse is sort of happening. There's a little bit of pushback on price. I think it was good for the market because I think we pushed past the upper limits of where pricing has ever been in Orange County and in California, for the most part in California. Certain markets, of course, not so much. So with an increase of inventory, lower interest rates, I think buyers have a great opportunity to look at the market and say, do I want to buy a home now? Is it a good time for my family or me, my partner, whatever it may be, to buy a home? And I think it really is. It's becoming more and more because they can begin to build wealth. They can begin to get the economic advantages of it. First-time home buyers, I think, couldn't be a better time to jump into the marketplace. Interest rates, will they go to 3% or 4%? I don't think so. But they will hover around the mid-5s, I'm predicting. That's what I'm kind of planning for in my companies, and that's where I think it will go.
Now, Mike, do you have any other thoughts for our audience?
Well, in kind of wrapping this all up in a nice little package with a bow on it, I think the historic changes that are taking place in real estate are the most historic changes in 100 years in the real estate industry. And I think that's worth noting. And I think the benefit of this, without a doubt, is the consumer. And I think as long as agents in our industry focus on the consumer, helping them to achieve their goals, taking them from where they are to where they dream of being, okay, or want to be in the future, we're going to be okay. I think my message to the consumer is I'm applauding you. I think it's fantastic. We have to prove our value to you. And if an agent can't do that, they don't deserve your business. And I think the message to a seller is we have to completely and transparently communicate with you and articulate our value and what the value is potentially of another buyer's agent. And you can determine if you want to pay that agent a fee or not. It's no longer up to us to do that. But I love the negotiability part of it. I love the fact that the consumer can benefit from these changes. And the reason I do is because they pay our bills. They pay our fees. Why should we not always be consumer-centric? It's funny because I was at a large meeting one time years ago, and I said, we are a consumer-centric company. And I had another agent from a well-known company stand up, national company, and say, that's not true. We're agent-centric, and we always will be. I said, you're wrong. It will always be consumer-centric. They pay your bills. And we almost got in a fight in this dinner table. It was like, oh my gosh, this is embarrassing, okay? So crazy as it may sound, consumers come first. And I think most of the really great people in our industry that have tremendous values and know how to do the business right will agree with me on that. Some of them won't because they're purely transactional. They see it as a means to an end, another end, and that's not the consumer with lifelong relationships. And to the consumer, I would say this is an opportune time for you with the market conditions that exist. There's a confluence of a decrease in interest rates. Not enough people are getting the word out where interest rates stand in the residential and even in the income producing markets like multifamily homes and things of that sort. Because all we're reading about is what the Federal Reserve is going to do. There's a lot of political jargon in the air today, as we can all know, right? But don't listen to that for a moment. Dig a little deeper and find out what interest rates are like online. Dig a little deeper with your representative. Maybe it be a real estate agent, maybe it be a loan representative, and see what kind of financing you can get because it's very, very favorable today. Very lenient in terms of qualifying. Keep your credit scores up, and it's a great time to buy a house. And it's funny because I had somebody come to me the other day and they said, I think the housing market's going to crash. I said, okay, why do you think that? Well, because prices are where they're at, unemployment's where it's at. And I stopped them. I said, what is the unemployment rate on a national level? They said, I don't know. I said, well, it's 4.3%. And then that means 95.7% of the people walking around today have a job that is paying their bills. That means 4%. And of those 4% or 4.3%, there's probably a percentage that aren't going to work anyway, right? Don't want to work, may not want to work. I don't know. So unemployment in Orange County, when you look around, Orange County is one of the most diverse places in this country when it comes to the economy because the two largest employers in Orange County are Disneyland and UCI, the health part of UCI, and the school itself, interestingly enough. So those two entities alone combine to employ about 50,000 plus employees. Fascinating. So there's a great opportunity in our market today to buy a home, begin to build your wealth. Great opportunity for people that will become next year, I hope, for people that want to move down in the marketplace, because there's currently a bill, the House of Representatives, which of course they won't bring to the floor to vote on because it's a political year, but it's called H.R. 1321. Now I'll give you that, H.R. 1321, follow it, research it and follow it, because what it will do is increase the capital gains exemption. It's a bipartisan bill. It's not subject to either party, bipartisan. It says we'll increase for a single taxpayer to $500,000 from $250,000 and increase for a married couple from $500,000 to $1 million. So a lot of people will be able to sell their homes that want to move down but don't want to pay the taxes in the coming years. And I think that will happen in 2025. That seems to be the consensus in our industry. And I think that's good for homeowners, okay? Because a lot of these folks that are maybe a little bit elderly are not able to keep up their homes like they did maybe in the past. Their incomes may be fixed. They can't do some of the maintenance. And as a result, their homes are not in as good a shape as they were maybe in the past. So I think there's a lot of benefits now, and there's a lot of future benefits that are on the way to assist homeowners and really further our interest in the home buying and home selling process.
Mike Hickman, CEO of 7 Gables, it was great to have you on California Insider.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you for allowing me the time to kind of explain what's going on in our industry and share some insight. I hope it was valuable to your listeners and to you as well. So thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.